Welcome to our live Q&A night. My name's David. I'm a pastor at Carrubbers Christian Centre in the centre of Edinburgh. It's great that you can join me in my study this evening. On the first Sunday of the month this year, we've been doing a series entitled The Skeletons in God's Closet. We've been thinking about some of the questions and issues in the Bible that cause people to question the goodness of God. Not just people who are skeptics and questioners, but also people who are Christians, things that disturb them and trouble them. We want to take these issues on and consider them. Tonight we're considering the question, does the Bible condone slavery? That coincides with another series that we've been going through the last few months at church in our evening series of preaching in the New Testament letter of Ephesians. The book of Ephesians is all about reconciliation. It tells us that there is a tremendous disruption in the universe between heaven and earth, between God and humans, and within human society itself. But the letter of Ephesians tells us that the person of Jesus Christ is good news. He is the solution to the disunity that we see in this world. Let me read to you a few verses. In chapter 1, Paul writes, "This is the plan. At the right time, God will bring everything back together under the rule of Christ, everything in heaven and earth." Chapter 2 goes on and says, "For Christ himself has brought peace to us. He united Jews and Gentiles into one people when in his own body on the cross he broke down the wall of hostility that separated us. Now all of us can come to the Father through the same Spirit because of what Jesus Christ has done for us." So the book of Ephesians is all about reconciliation, and we're going to be thinking about not just social distinctions tonight, but also the issue of racism, the Black Lives Matter movement that has been in the press over the last few weeks. During the course of the evening, you can go on to slido.com, use our event reference 32803, and you can pose questions during the talk, which then we'll come back and answer afterwards. And hopefully we'll wrap up around about 8 o'clock tonight. I've been asked to try and keep it a little bit tighter than last month when we went on a little bit too long. So, without further ado, we're asking the question, does the Bible condone slavery? Let's consider that now.
8 minutes and 46 seconds. That's how long a police officer knelt on the neck of George Floyd, ignoring his desperate pleas, "I can't breathe," until he died. I tried to watch the horrific video, but found it too upsetting to finish. For this was not an isolated incident, it was only the latest exposure of the dark underbelly of America's struggles with racism and the lingering shadow of slavery. Also, the sin of slavery is part of our colonial history here in Britain. That's why recently we have seen mass protests breaking out in the streets, historic statues of people associated with slavery being torn down, and classic television shows being censored due to their racial insensitivities. It's against that background that we're asking tonight's question, does the Bible condone slavery? Now tonight we were pre-scheduled to be studying a passage in the Bible called Ephesians chapter 6, and it begins with these words, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters." And so at first glance it would appear that the answer is yes, the Bible does condone slavery. But before we start wondering if the Bible should be censored or banned, if statues of crosses should be torn down, churches boarded up, we need to realise that the writer of this letter, the Apostle Paul, lived during a time when more than half of the Roman Empire's population were slaves. Paul here is not defending or legitimising the institution of slavery. He is simply addressing the fact that it exists, and recognising that the tiny Christian community will be unable to remodel the entire way of life across the empire. Instead, Paul explains what they can do, which is model a counter-cultural way of life within the Christian household. That's why in these verses, Paul reassures the Christian slave that they possess a newfound dignity. No matter how menial their job or social status, they now have the high privilege of serving a heavenly master. Verse 7 and 8 says, "Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free." He's saying they can take pride. Just as if you were the lowliest servant in Buckingham Palace, you'd be able to take pride in the fact that you worked for the Queen. So also these Christian slaves, they work for God. At the same time, Paul warns the masters of Christian households that God will hold them accountable for how they treat their servants. Verse 9. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. This was revolutionary stuff at the time. In fact, the letters of Paul undermined the foundations on which slavery was built. Paul lit the long fuse that would later destroy slavery for centuries in Europe. Later, after the revival of the slave trade in Europe, Paul's letters inspired the work of the abolitionist William Wilberforce. To tackle ignorance and rehumanize slaves in people's minds, Wilberforce printed posters like this, bearing the caption, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Those words were inspired by Paul's letter to Philemon, which encouraged him to treat his runaway slave converted under Paul's ministry as no longer a slave, but better than a slave, as a beloved brother. If you consider me a partner, receive him as you would receive me. Elsewhere in his letters, Paul wrote about equality in the church. He says, there is no slave, there is no free, for we are all one in Christ Jesus. Similarly, today we live 20 centuries after Paul, and we believe that everyone should be treated equally, fairly, decently. That's why we object to slavery. But the question we have to consider is, where did those ideas come from? You see, we didn't get them from the Greeks or the Romans. Aristotle observed that since people had differing natural abilities, some people were in essence born to be tools, and others were born to be kings. The idea that all men and women, or that all races were equal, that was ludicrous. And so what changed? Well, it's because we live in a society that has been revolutionized by Christianity. On the very first page of the Bible, it declares that all human beings have been made in the image of God, sharing equally in glory and dignity in the sight of God. That's why the secular sociologist Rodney Stark has written, of all the world's religions, including the three great monotheisms, only in Christianity did the idea develop that slavery was sinful and must be abolished. Slavery was once nearly universal to all societies able to afford it. Only in the West did significant moral opposition ever arise and lead to abolition. I believe it's just so important that we recognise the history of the positive influence of Christianity on our society here in the Western world, especially if we're going to seek to tackle racial injustice and inequalities that persist today. It is the teachings of the Bible that have helped us come this far, and I believe the biblical worldview still has the resources to help us go further still. That's why the celebrated civil rights activist, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, famously preached that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I believe the Bible, he said. However, as our society moves further away from the biblical worldview, I fear that we are not moving towards justice, but towards the abyss. Let me explain why, by comparing tonight the secular worldview and the biblical worldview, especially as they relate to these current racial issues in our society. Let's look first of all at the secular worldview. If it had hashtags, it would be perhaps no lives matter, or at very best, some lives matter more than others. The worldview of secular humanism is based upon the rejection of all supernatural deities and religious beliefs. If you read the definition on the British Humanist website, you will see that they believe that this life in this world is all there is, and they say that we should work to make it as good as possible for everyone. Many humanists are wonderful people. They work hard to do good in our society. Nevertheless, at the level of ideas, there is a significant problem for the secular worldview. In it, human beings are reduced to being blobs of carbon floating from one meaningless existence to another. Our lives are the blink of an eye in cosmic time. The whole history of human achievements is destined for the abyss of nothingness in the cold solar death of the solar system. Ultimately, no lives matter. Or as I said earlier, at best, only some lives matter. For example, take Charles Darwin, who famously made atheism intellectually respectable. I wonder, do you know the full title of Charles Darwin's world-changing book, The Origin of the Species? Well, here it is. The preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. This caused a controversy a few years ago whenever Darwin's face was printed on banknotes for the first time. Many people pointed out that his atheistic evolutionary idea of the survival of the fittest applied to human society had been used to justify racist and eugenic policies in the last century, bringing misery and death to many. That's also why the atheist journalist Douglas Murray wrote an article entitled, "Would Human Life Be Sacred in an Atheist World?" His conclusion was no, especially not at the extremities of life for the unborn and the elderly. You see, the secular humanistic worldview does not possess the resources to support our convictions about the dignity and equality of all human beings. Instead, the secular historian Tom Holland has recognised, much to his own shock and surprise, that these values were in fact borrowed from Christianity. He writes in his recent important book, Dominion, that human beings have rights, that they are born equal, that they are owed sustenance and shelter and refuge from persecution. These were never self-evident truths. He continues, the wellspring of humanist values lay not in reason, not in evidence-based thinking, but in history. The revolution preached by St. Paul. Had it been otherwise, then no one would ever have got woke. This is the fruit of our Christian heritage, the biblical worldview. The dilemma for our society today is, can the fruit survive without that root? Can the plant survive being transplanted into a different soil which is acidically opposed to the biblical worldview? That's where we are today. The different soil is called critical theory. Although you may not have heard of it, you will have witnessed the revolutionary changes that it's brought about in our society over the last 20 years. Indeed, critical theory is the philosophy of the Black Lives Matter organisation. The central tenet of critical theory is that we don't need God for ultimate meaning or morality. Instead, we can invent purpose for ourselves. We can become good people by working for social justice. Critical theory views the world through the glasses and the lens of power. It divides society into two groups: the oppressors, privileged groups, and the oppressed, disadvantaged groups. For example, there's racial oppression between white and non-white people. There's sexual oppression between male and female, the patriarchy. There's heteronormative oppression, heterosexuals against homosexuals. There's gender oppression, cisgender, that's binary gender, versus transgender, fluid gender. Critical theory advocates for liberation through the reversal of power, the redistribution of resources away from the dominant group, and a restructuring of society for the benefit of the minority group. Rather than fulfilling Martin Luther King's vision of his children one day not being judged by the colour of their skin, but rather by the content of their character, instead, in critical theory, people are defined and judged by what groups they identify with. For example, one critical race theorist, Robin DiAngelo, wrote in her best-selling book, White Fragility, no individual member of a dominant group has to do anything specific to oppress a member of the minority group. We must challenge the dominant conceptualization of racism as individual acts that only some bad individuals do, rather than as a system in which we all are implicated. Reading her book, I was left feeling condemned for enjoying unearned and unjust privileges as a white, heterosexual, able-bodied, cisgendered man. Now let me say, I believe that critical theory is seeing things. It makes valid observations of our world. But I believe that its interpretation of these things and its proposed solutions, can I go so far as to say I believe that they're dangerous? I believe that there are at least two significant problems with it. The first problem is, I believe it's dangerous to divide the world into groups like good people versus bad people, especially when you then assign guilt, moral guilt, to those groups. For example, to say, like DiAngelo, that all white people are essentially racist. They are part of a racist system, regardless of what they think or say or do themselves as individuals. It may be really comforting to think that all the goodness in the world is in you and attaches to your group, that all the badness in the world is in your enemies, attaches to them. But when you divide society into groups competing for power against a common enemy, you don't get reconciliation that way. Instead, you just perpetuate resentment. Interestingly, that's why Martin Luther King believed in nonviolent protest. He once preached, "Hate begets hate. We must meet the forces of hate with the power of love. Our aim must never be to defeat or humiliate the white man, but to win his friendship and understanding." He understood that racial reconciliation is only going to be possible when we recognize our common humanity, that we are all God's children. That's the first problem of critical theory. The second problem is critical theory fails to recognize that the oppressed can also be oppressors. I've appreciated how that truth is depicted in the popular novel and recent BBC drama Noughts and Crosses. In it, Mallory Blackman imagines that Europe has been colonized by Africa, its white population enslaved, and in her alternative 20th century, the Noughts, the people with lighter skin tone, they are segregated and oppressed by the Crosses, those with darker skin tone. It's a fascinating portrayal of the fact that all of us possess the capacity to oppress other people, that there is no virtue or vice attached to skin colour, that a different social structure is no guarantee of ending oppression. Instead, the fact that we all possess the natural capacity for oppressing others. Just go look at a school playground. You'll see it in action. That capacity, that inbuilt instinctive capacity, is evidence that there is something wrong much deeper in the human condition. And the Bible talks about that. It calls it sin. Critical theory cannot address sin. Critical theory cannot change the human heart, the human condition. But God's Son, Jesus Christ, can. And so let's move on from thinking about the secular worldview to think about the biblical worldview. And the hashtag here would be Black Lives Matter, because all lives matter to God. You see, in the biblical worldview, there are three truths that help bridge the many divisions between people in this world. The first thing is creation. On the very first page of the Bible, God tells us that human beings are not cosmic accidents. Rather, every one of us has a maker who has lovingly made us in his image. Although we talk about different races, in reality there is only one race, the human race, and it is full of diversity in all sorts of ways. That's what enabled Rev Dr. Martin Luther King to once preach, "There are no gradations in the image of God. Every man from treble white to bass black is significant in God's keyboard, precisely because every man is made in the image of God." And of course we would add to that every woman too. The Bible enables us to declare that black lives matter because all lives matter to God, from the womb to the tomb. And we are obligated to love, respect and value everyone who bears and shares in that image too. But creation isn't the only thing that unites us all together. There's a second thing, and that is sin. You see, unfortunately, the human race has spurned the love of God, our Maker. Not content to live as the image of God, we have attempted to become our own gods, ruling over our little kingdoms of self. The root of racism is a sinful pride and a selfish love for ourselves, which leads us to harbour prejudice, mistrust, even hatred against those who are different to us. Sinful people can create sinful structures that then oppress other people. And let's be absolutely clear, there are unjust, sinful structures in our society today. Just listen to the lived experience of Rennie Edo-Lodge in her book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. When someone is being treated differently or unfairly because of an innate characteristic like their ethnicity, their skin colour, their gender, that is sinful. And any such unjust structures which are perpetuating that sin, they should be challenged. They should be reformed. However, the ultimate solution to racial injustice requires going much deeper to address sin in the human heart. It also requires going much higher, because sin is not just an offence against another human being. It is also an offence against the living God in whose image that person has been made. And God in his justice is committed to destroy all evil, including racism. That takes us into the third unifying theme of the Bible, and that is redemption. The Bible introduces us to the God who once rescued his people Israel from slavery in Egypt, and later came in the person of Jesus Christ to rescue the human race from its greatest oppressors, sin, and sin's consequence, death. And that's why the word redemption, it's 8 minutes and 46 seconds.
Apologies, I've knocked that off before it finished. But I'm not able to get it back to where it was, so let me just pick up roughly where we were in the talk. We had just heard that section from Philippians chapter 2 that talks about what Jesus has done, how Jesus through his death on the cross has paid the redemption price to set us free. He suffered the penalty that our sins deserve. Jesus in his resurrection has demonstrated that he is the source of new life, that he can cleanse the human heart from the very worst stains of sin, able to cleanse our hearts from prejudice, from partiality, from racism, from sectarianism. And maybe tonight you need to consider asking Jesus for the very first time to deal with those sins that lurk within your heart. Then, like the former slave trader John Newton, you might be able to sing the wonderful words of the hymn, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. John Newton truly experienced what it means to get woke. But Jesus doesn't just change individuals and their hearts, he also creates new communities. Today, Christianity is the most multi-ethnic and diverse religion and society in the world. The great untold story of the last century is the huge explosion of Christianity in the two-thirds world, in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. That explains why the Bible finishes with this wonderful vision of people from every tribe, nation, tongue, and language gathered around the throne of God, worshipping him. And the local church here in this world should be a preview of that future final day. It should be a countercultural community where peace and harmony is exhibited to the world without critical theory being necessary. When in the past the church has failed to live up to this high and holy calling from God, then it needs to seek God's grace for forgiveness and change. For example, recently I've been appreciating listening to the presentations of people like the panel who spoke about racism in the church in the UK. And they were suggesting that there are ways that we can do better as a church in welcoming people who are of different cultures and different ethnicities into our church, inviting them to share their stories, to tell us about their experiences, releasing them to use their God-given gifts to bless the church and to advance our mission. These are good things for us in Carrubbers to consider. But as we finish up, and I'm sorry I don't have the slide on the screen, but I want to just finish off and tell you a story about a man called Tom Tarrance. I recently read his book entitled Consumed by Hate, Redeemed by Love. In the 1960s, he was a terrorist. He belonged to one of the most violent groups of the Ku Klux Klan. He was seriously wounded in a police shootout after attempting to bomb a civil rights activist. In prison, Tom Tarrance's heart was changed when he encountered Jesus Christ through the message of the gospel. He experienced the love and the power of Jesus that can change people's hearts. And since then, he has worked tirelessly to work against racism and prejudice in America. And he finishes his book with 3 practical suggestions about what we can do to respond to this topic that we've been thinking about together this evening. The first one is to pray for God to give you insight into your own heart and perhaps attitudes, prejudices, partiality in your heart against people who are different. Maybe you can't see it. Maybe you need to ask God to reveal if there's anything there. The second thing Tom Tarrance suggests is that you should read for truth. You should listen to other people's perspectives. Read about the truth of the history of race relations and immigration in our country. Listen to the experiences of people who are ethnic minorities in our country. You may not think that racism is a big deal, but listen to others and find out whether your perspective is limited. And the third and final response that he suggests is to reach out to someone who is of a different culture or a different ethnicity to you and build a genuine, honest, real friendship with them where you extend love and honesty to them. He says these are 3 ways that we can do far better for healing the racial divides that there are in our society than by going down the path suggested by critical theory. Well, I'm sorry that there's just that technical hitch towards the end of the talk. You'll see in the description of the live stream there's a link to a pre-recorded version of the talk where you'll get the full uninterrupted version of it. But now we're moving on to our time of questions. I don't know if there's anything been sent in just yet. I was trying to check just whenever I knocked things off. But to go to slido.com and go to our event 32803 and you can post in your questions. Let's see what we've got here. Top question so far is, why doesn't the Bible have a verse, especially for Israel in the Old Testament, that says slavery is bad? Wouldn't that have helped to avoid so much interpretation? Well, that's a good question. We haven't really thought about slavery in the Old Testament scriptures this evening. We were focused on what Paul says in the New Testament, but this is a very important question. When you go through the law that God gave to Israel, you have to understand that we are in the middle of the story. We're not at the very, very good beginning, where God created all human beings in his image and likeness, equal in dignity and honor and glory. And we're not at the very, very good ending of the story either, whenever God makes all things right. Instead, we're in the middle of the mess. And the ancient world, there were very few societies that did not engage in slavery of one sort or another. There was debt slavery, which existed in Israel, and there was also chattel slavery, that's property slavery, where people were treated not as human beings, but as property belonging to someone. The latter form, chattel slavery, is the type of slavery that comes to our minds most when we think about that subject today and what happened in antebellum America in the 17th, 18th century. What's interesting is when you go in and look at the Old Testament, it doesn't legitimize the institution of slavery. It doesn't set it as an ideal. Instead, you'll find in places like Deuteronomy that is it Deuteronomy chapter 15, it talks about how God's intention, God's ideal for the Israelite society is that there would be no poor people among you. But also God recognizes that we live in a world that is very far from being perfect, where things go wrong. People make bad decisions. People suffer the effects of droughts. They get into debt. And sometimes they had to become slaves, debt slaves. This for us would be an equivalent of employment. This would be the equivalent of saying, I owe this money and I'm not going to be able to pay it off through growing enough crops and selling them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer to work for the person I owe money to and work off my debt and pay them back that way. That was the type of slavery, if you like, the servanthood, this type of servitude that existed in Israel. And the most incredible thing about the law in Israel and how it treated debt slaves was how God refused to allow it to become an ideal or to become the status quo. Every 7 years, all the debt slaves in Israel had to be released. All their debts had to be cleared. They were to be sent back to their families, to their original ancestral plots of land. They got a fresh start. Every 50 years, the same thing happened. The entire country got a year's rest from labor. Whenever you go through the Ten Commandments, when you get to the fourth commandment, the Sabbath day commandment, you have to understand that that was a wonderful blessing for the people of Israel. They had just escaped from slavery in Egypt, where they were made to work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day in some cases. And God comes along and says, no, I want you to have an entire day in the week of rest. That was an incredible blessing. And there are many other examples in the law of Israel that shows you that what God set out, it was revolutionary. When you compare what is in the Old Testament law for Israel and you compare it with the other societies that we have, that we can look at historically, you will see that the laws of Israel, they stand apart. They are so much more humane. They're unprecedented in terms of what they do to try and minimize and get rid of the necessity of debt slavery and to very tightly police it, and at the end of every 7 years to release those who are in debt, who have had to become slaves. And so I appreciate that, it would be really helpful if there was just one verse that simply said it. If you like, that verse is in the very first chapter, the very first page of the Bible. You cannot make someone who's made in the image of God, you cannot treat them as anything less than that in God's eyes. That is sinful, that is wicked, that is evil. God is against that. But in the law, God recognizes that sometimes things go wrong and people need to work off their debts, and he sets up this whole system which controls and deals with that problem. So I think actually you'll find that the Old Testament was ahead of its times and was a good thing. Let's move on to another question. The top question now that's popped up is, would you like to comment on the fact that on secular social media the term all lives matter was used, not no lives or some lives, but was seen as racist? So I have been following some of the things that have been going on, and I have seen that phrase all lives matter, if it's used as a blanket statement, has been a way of trying to avoid saying Black Lives Matter. Very deliberately, that my second point was entitled Black Lives Matter because all lives matter to God, because God loves all lives. There's been various memes of Christians who have, there's a famous parable that Jesus tells about a shepherd who has 100 sheep, and one of those sheep goes missing, and he leaves behind the 99 sheep, and he goes and searches and finds the one lost sheep. And I've seen various Christian cartoons and memes that have talked about how actually if you think all lives matter, then you should say, well, actually 99 sheep's lives matter more than the one. The very reason why we say Black Lives Matter is because we recognize that they're the ones who are in many cases experiencing discrimination, who are suffering injustice. And it is right, it is biblical, it is godly to speak up for those who are suffering, who are the victims of injustice and evil in this world. So that's the reason why I said Black Lives Matter, because all lives matter to God. I don't believe that's a racist statement. I believe that that's a way of trying to hold together and balance those different perspectives. I hope that's helpful clarification. Next top question is, why do you think such questions are rarely asked of Islam when Muhammad was himself a slave trader? I wish that I had my friend Andy Bannister on with me. He's an expert in Islamic studies and is writing a book on this at the moment. As I understand it historically, what this questioner has said is true. Islamic society, as again, most ancient societies, practiced slavery. Why is it that Christians, though, are singled out? Why is it the Bible comes in for particular attention? And I think that's a really important question. I think that reveals that whether people mean to or not, there is an agenda here. Here in the Western world, there are those who are in positions of power and influence who are hostile to Christian beliefs, who want to see our society reconfigured along different lines, and recognize that part of doing that is going to be to discredit our Christian heritage and the influence of the Bible in our society. And so they are willing to turn a blind eye to inconvenient facts like that about other religions, about Islam, in order to press the attack against Christianity. That's just, I think that is willful blindness to that reality. What do we do about that? Well, I think that we continue to speak the truth in love, and we need to recognize and not just single out anybody. All ancient societies practiced slavery. Rodney Stark, early in the talk, he talked about in his book, and he's by and large a secular sociologist, and he recognizes that it was Christian monotheism that alone led to the disapproval of slavery, that it was an immoral institution and called for its abolition. That's something that Christians can be proud of. Thomas Sowell, the African-American economist and philosopher, he talks about how all ancient societies practiced slavery, and we should be very careful about those who want to call out the sins of particular Western nations with Christian heritage and use that as a way of trying to advance their social change agenda. So hopefully that addresses your question. There's certainly more to think about there. Next question. Just as Jesus' anger in the temple marketplace was just, is the anger that has resulted in statues of slave traders being torn down and vandalized just? I joked when I saw someone recently for a walk early one morning that I asked them whether there were any statues nearby of slave traders that we could pull down for some fun. It is interesting to see that cultural phenomenon going on. I'm not sure that the comparison with what Jesus did in the temple and what is happening in our society with statues is quite the right comparison. Jesus went into a place of worship, a place that was to be dedicated to the worship of God, and he saw people were exploiting others, that they were seeking to make money of others who had come to worship God, and that was a desecration of God's holy place. The Jewish temple had a place in it called the court of the Gentiles. Gentiles, people who were not Jewish, they could not come into the inner part of the temple. It was holy, and they were unclean and not unholy. They only had this outside courtyard where they could come to pray. That's as close as they could get. And it's suggested by some commentators that it was in the court of the Gentiles that the tables of the money traders were set up. And so people who were coming from far off nations, who were coming to worship God but could get no closer, these marketeers were preventing them coming to worship and learn about God, and that especially aroused and provoked Jesus's anger. I think it's a different thing what's happening in our society whenever people are saying this individual was a part of a system that traded in human life and made money off the misery and slavery of other human beings, and that is disgraceful, and we should not celebrate them and their legacy. I think it's a complicated issue. What you do with Winston Churchill, for example, that's a big question, and some of the things that he was responsible for in his policies with the British Empire. A great British hero in many ways to many people, and yet there is also this dark side of his legacy. I think the statue situation reminds us that we're not meant to put people on pedestals. I'm pretty sure the Bible doesn't approve of us putting any human being on a pedestal. It reminds us that all human beings have feet of clay, that all human beings, that yes, they are capable of incredible good, but we also have that inbuilt deep capacity of committing evil, sin. And every single person on a podium, on a pedestal, they are a sinful human being. There are things that you can find out about them that would just turn your hair grey, that would make you feel sick. So I think to that question, I think that the comparison with Jesus is not the most helpful one. I think you'll have to do some more thinking about the issues before you decide whether it's a good thing or not to pull down statues. These are hard questions tonight. The next top question is, how do we navigate between the politicization of the Black Lives Matter movement, trying to push the agenda of the LGBT movement? How do we navigate between the politicization? I think there's a distinction to be made between agreeing with the statement Black Lives Matter and supporting the organization. That's not simple, because also the slogan and the hashtag Black Lives Matter is trademarked and copyrighted. So there are those. That's partly why some people say all lives matter. It's because they say this organization and this slogan are inseparably attached, and I cannot support the agenda on the website of this organization. I'm willing to separate the slogan and the organization, but I do think we have to be very careful and we should do our reading. We should investigate, what are these groups calling for? What does social justice mean to these organizations? Because what we should be committed to as Christians is biblical justice. There are many passages in the scriptures that talk about God's heart for injustice. For example, in the book of Micah chapter 6 verse 8, what does the Lord require of you, O man, but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? God cares about his people doing justice. The book of Isaiah in chapter 58, the people of Israel are complaining to God. They're saying, why aren't we do all these rituals, we fast, we make sacrifices, but you don't seem to be hearing us and listening to us, God. God responds to his people and tells them what kind of fasting he wants. Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your own house? When you see the naked, to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh? Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring forth speedily. Your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. And you shall cry, and he will say, here I am. God is concerned very much for those who are on the margins of society, those who are suffering, those who are being treated unfairly, those who are in desperate need of help. That's biblical justice. The challenge that we face with the Black Lives Matter movement and of the wider critical theory agenda is that it's not about biblical justice. It's not about looking for where there are people being treated wrongly and unfairly, but rather it is a political belief that any kind of different outcome necessarily means that there is unfair treatment going on behind the scenes. And that's not true. There can be many different reasons for there being unequal outcomes in society. It's not just simply evidence of systemic racism or systemic sexism or whatever. Very interesting, two different people on the political spectrum, two secular people. Jonathan Haidt on the left, great video worth watching on YouTube about, just watch his video. Just type in Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, professor of moral psychology, New York University. Jonathan Haidt, equity or equality. And another person on the right, Jordan Peterson, again, just type in equity and equality and you'll get these two different videos. You've got a guy on the left, a guy on the right, neither of them Christians, but they're both saying that unequal outcomes does not necessarily mean unequal treatment. That is what injustice would be if there is unequal treatment of people. But what the critical theory agenda believes, it assumes that is taking place on the basis of sex, gender, sexual orientation, race. It assumes that there is this oppressed matrix, this privilege and disadvantage matrix, and then it sets out to correct it and overthrow it. It sets out to try and bring about equal outcomes for everyone in society, regardless of differences that are there, or different inputs that they make into the system that lead into different outcomes. So we have to be very careful as Christians that we don't just hitch ourselves onto this bandwagon, which is incredibly powerful, incredibly popular, which is being promoted and pushed in the media. We've got to do our reading, we've got to do our thinking. I think it's just really important that we see that there are non-Christian writers on different parts of the political spectrum who would agree with us that justice does not equal the type of social justice that the critical theory movement is calling for. And we need to be very careful that we understand what biblical justice is and stand for biblical justice and biblical social reform, and be very wary of jumping on the bandwagon of other groups pushing for a very different type of social revolution that would take us away from many of the ways that the Bible has positively influenced our society in the past. So I hope that's an answer to that question, points you away to some other resources worth looking up and educating yourself with. Next question is sort of related to that. Do you think Christians as a corporate group should lobby governments and or protest about injustices, race-related or otherwise? As a corporate group, that I'm not so sure about. That you can form Christian pressure groups and action groups where there are people of similar views and passions and gifts, where they want to campaign and work together for a better society. Join those if you want to. That would be a corporate Christian group. But if we're talking about the Church of Jesus Christ, should the Church of Jesus Christ be protesting? Should it be lobbying? That I'm not as sure is at the core and essential to the mission that Jesus has given the church. I think there needs to be a distinction drawn between the mission that Jesus has entrusted to his church as a corporate entity and the much wider, I think that's narrow actually, Jesus has called his church and to proclaim the good news about Jesus, to teach God's word, to be a countercultural community in the midst of this world, to make and to shape followers, disciples of Jesus. That's the essential work of the church. But then the much wider calling of Christian individuals and Christian parachurch organizations and other groupings, they have the much larger responsibility of being salt and light out in the world, of making a difference for Christ in their different spheres of influence, their different callings, their different vocations, using their different gifts and passions to hold back what is evil and to seek to bring in what is good and right and just and true and beautiful. So I think that if you're talking about the church, then I don't think that it is essential that the church is on the front lines lobbying and campaigning. And I think the church has a job to disciple and train and equip Christians to go out and do that in the world. I wrote my thesis on this question. I read 500 books and articles, and my head is often wrestling with these things, and did for 3 years. And if you want to talk to me more about that or want to read that, get in touch with me. I'm happy to share with you where I got to in my work. Let's see what the next question is. How would you respond to someone who says slavery in the past centuries was a result of the Christian faith in a clear, concise manner? That's hard, but I would want to maybe start a conversation. Sometimes it's really helpful when we're involved in conversations with people to not just think, right, what's going to be my response to this? What's my knockdown tweet that I can say that closes down all discussion, wins the argument? Sometimes it can be really, really helpful to go deeper and to begin asking questions of the other person. So begin asking questions like, what makes you say that? What makes you believe that Christianity is directly responsible for slavery in the past? Certainly, it is true that there are Christians in the past who were slave owners, who were involved in slavery. We see that in the southern states of America. There were Christians who were took the side in the Civil War that was fighting to maintain that institution. There were those who believed that there were passages in Scripture that justified the institution of slavery. But get in the conversation, find out where that's coming from, why that person is making that claim, what is their evidence, what have they read, or what's making them think that. And then you'll be able to talk more clearly about those specific things. So there's certain texts that were proof texts for those who defended slavery from the Bible. Well, let's go and look at those texts. Let's challenge them. I believe that those were wrongly interpreted, wrongly applied texts. I believe instead that, as we talked about a little bit earlier, whenever we find slavery mentioned in the Old Testament, it is not God's ideal. It is not what God intended in the start. It's not what God ever will allow to continue in the future. But in the midst of this world, in all this brokenness and fallenness, God instituted and regulated and contained and controlled it. and made it in the land of Israel as good as possible. In the Roman Empire, in the Christian household, made it as good as possible. I think that realizing the story that we're in, rather than picking out proof texts and building a whole edifice upon it, that's very dangerous in this area and many other areas. So ask some questions, find out why they're saying that, what's their evidence, what are their reasons for asking that. That would be a really helpful thing, rather than me giving you a really clear, concise answer that knocks down the conversation and shuts it down. Ask some questions. Another question is, why didn't Jesus say or do more about slavery? I think we have to understand that Jesus did not come into this world to be a social revolutionary, a social reformer. He's come he has come to deal with humanity's biggest problem, which is not poverty, which is not inequality. The deepest problem that human beings have is our spiritual poverty, the fact that we have been cut off from God through our sin, our rebellion, our turning our backs on God. Jesus has come to deal with the demands of God's justice against sin and sinners, which calls for our death. We have chosen and sided with evil. God is determined to reclaim this world and renew this world and remove from it evil. And we're on the wrong side. And God could just wipe us all out, could just wipe the world clean. And yet the Bible also testifies to God being a God of love and mercy and grace, who wants to save people from their evil, so that they'll be able to enjoy and be a part of his new world, be a part of his kingdom. That is the primary reason why Jesus came. It is to deal with that ultimate source of evil, that ultimate problem that we have, that all of us are on the wrong side of God's justice. Jesus come to satisfy God's justice in our place, to make it possible for us to be, in the words of the New Testament, justified, to be forgiven, to be made right with God, and then to change our hearts through his Holy Spirit so that we would become people who do justice in this world. Jesus ministered to those who were poor and who were weak and who were marginalized. His very first sermon, the Nazareth Manifesto in Luke chapter 4, talks about how he's come to release the prisoners and the captives, to bring good news to the poor. Jesus, in his Olivet discourse in Matthew chapters 24 and 25, tells his followers that on the last day, part of how they will give an account to God for how they've lived their lives is what they have done. What have they done to those in prison, those who were naked, those who were hungry, those who were sick? Jesus has modeled for us and taught the importance of compassion and caring for those who are the weakest and the least. So Jesus modeled all those things, and his followers followed in his example. But they were more than just one person. Although they were small, as the message of Jesus spread, as more and more people turned back to God, trusted in Jesus, as more of them had their hearts changed, their status before God changed, their hearts changed, they were able to do more and more and more good throughout the Roman Empire, until you get to the 4th century, when Julian the Apostate emperor complains that the Christians are putting the rest of the Romans to shame because of how they care, not just for their own poor people, but also they care for the poor people of all the empire. It puts the rest of them to shame. So what Jesus did, if you like, is Jesus was a pebble thrown into the pond, and he sets off these ripples that have transformed the world. And we have so much, as Tom Holland talks about in his book Dominion, so many of the things that we take for granted today, some of the values that we have, some of the things that we consider to be important, the whole woke movement itself, it's actually deep down can be traced back to Jesus and his influence and his example. So I hope that answers your question. Maybe time for one more. The next one's a fun one. Is the relationship between President Trump and evangelical Christians problematic for the Great Commission? I've got in trouble before for talking about such things. Can I say that I fear that it is possible for Christians to play the same game as the critical theorists. The critical theorists see everything as being about power. And unfortunately, I think that there are some Christians who believe that if only we have the power, that we can that we can keep society on an even keel, that we can have things our way, we can ensure that things are done in ways that we think is right and hold back evil. The problem is that whenever the majority of people in a society are not Christians, who don't have changed hearts, who have no interest in God and God's ways and no love for God's laws, when you try to impose power on them, you will get resentment. And I fear for some of our American brothers and sisters that they are playing by the same rules set by the critical theorists, and they endanger bringing great hostility against the gospel of Jesus by trying to control people. So I think that's all I want to say on that one. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. There's more questions. I've not been able to get to them, but I did want to finish at 8 o'clock. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for listening. I'm sorry for the technical problem that we had. Again, in the description to the video that you'll find a link that you can watch again. If you like, if you go onto Facebook, our Facebook page, there's a link to an article that writes up the key points on Alistair Chalmers' blog that was posted on Friday. So check that out and you'll be able to review the talk in your own time. We've got an opportunity if you would like to follow up and explore more about the Christian faith. If you were to email us at explore@carrubbers.org, then we'll be able to put you in touch with our team. They're going to be in the month of August running a study called Uncover, where you can read one of the accounts of Jesus, the life of Jesus, the Gospel of Mark, and there'll be a chance to read it through and talk about, discuss it, and find out more about who Jesus is. And then later on in September, we're going to be launching a course called Christianity Explored that we've run for many years, which again is about looking into the Gospels of Jesus and considering who is Jesus, why has he come, and what does it mean to follow him. And we'd love to help you on your journey and to explore more of these things. So just email us at explore@carrubbers.org if you would like to follow up and think more about who Jesus is. But from me tonight, thank you so much for joining us. Pray that God will bless you into this new week. And remember that God is a God who cares about justice, and through the person of Jesus is able to bring people together who otherwise in this world have nothing in common and many things that divide them. So that's good news. Thanks for joining us. Good night.